Who's director of photography and layout at Pixar Animation Studios. Matt joined Pixar in February of 2004 as a layout artist on Cars. He has since done a combination of cinematography and sets pre-visualization on the many films he's been part of, such as the Academy Award-winning WALL-E, Up, Toy Story 3, as well as The Good Dinosaur. He served as a director of photography on Monsters University, as well as on Pixar's Academy Award-winning feature films Coco and Soul. He's currently working in layout as the lead sets pre-visualization artist on Pixar's upcoming feature film Lightyear, set to release in June of 2022. As director of photography for layout, Matt and his team are responsible for choreographing the camera and character staging of the entire film. During his time on a project, Asbury works closely with the film's director, lead editor, and lighting director of photography to determine how to best convey the story visually. Matt, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And I've just learned that clearly the word I'm going to have trouble with today is pre-visualization. As I said, I said it twice and I got it wrong both times.
Did pretty good to me. Everybody stumbles over that one.
Also joining us is Danielle Feinberg, who's the visual effects supervisor also at Pixar Animation Studios. Danielle is a visual effects supervisor at Pixar. She began her career at Pixar in 1997 after receiving her BA in computer science from Harvard University. Her first position was on the movie A Bug's Life as a render wrangler, an entry-level problem-solving position, and she soon was leading the otherwise all-male department. Danielle got her first taste of lighting during this time and fell in love with creating the final image for film. She went on to light many of Pixar's films, including Toy Story 2, Monsters, Inc., the Oscar-winning Finding Nemo, and The Incredibles. Another Oscar winner, WALL-E, was Danielle's first movie directing the lighting in her role as director of photography for lighting. She went on to oversee the lighting on two more Oscar-winning films, Brave, featuring Pixar's first film with a girl as a main character, and Coco. Danielle is currently working on Pixar's future release Turning Red, where she has taken on the role of visual effects supervisor. She gives talks to girls of all ages, encouraging them to pursue code, math, and science by demonstrating to them the magic found in combining art and technology to create movies. In 2016, she was able to bring that message to a broader audience with her TED Talk that was part of the PBS Science and Wonder presentation for TED Talks Live, and it was named one of the top TED Talks of 2016. Danielle, thank you so much for being here today.
Total pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Move on to Mohit Kalyanpur. I hope I'm getting your surname correct. I'm sorry.
That's pretty good.
All right. So it seems close enough. Photography lighting on the Academy Award-winning Frozen and Frozen 2. He's been with Walt Disney Animation Studios since 1996 and has worked on beloved films including Moana, Zootopia, Big Hero 6, Tangled, Chicken Little, and Treasure Planet. Mohit, thank you so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure.
And Kent Secchi is the head of cinematography at Nickelodeon Animation on the feature film Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Next Chapter, slated for release in 2023. Kent most recently completed work as head of cinematography on Paramount Animation's upcoming 2022 feature Rumble, as well as consulting on The Tiger Apprentice. Previously, he worked at the virtual reality storytelling company Baobab Studios, where he won a Daytime Emmy as lead pre-visualization artist on their interactive short Crow the Legend in 2019. Before working for Baobab, Kent worked at DreamWorks Animation as the director of pre-visualization on the feature animated film Boss Baby. He also worked as a rough layout artist at PDI on Penguins of Madagascar, Puss in Boots, and Turbo, in addition to being the director of pre-visualization on both Mr. Peabody and Sherman and Megamind. Prior to joining DreamWorks Animation, Kent was the creative director for the visual effects company that pioneered the use of computer-generated pre-visualization pixel liberation front, PLF. There he worked as the visualization and HUD effects supervisor on Iron Man, for which he was nominated for a Visual Effects Society Award in 2008, and also on set visual effects supervisor on the horror film Stay Alive. He currently lives in Palo Alto, California with his wife and 17-year-old son. Kent, thank you so much for being here. And we lost him again.
Kent, you gotta keep that out.
So I will check, but I'm sure he will be back.
Kent is on an Android too, so this is very exciting.
So that is our extraordinary panel, but now I'm just going to kick it over to our two panelists, Youngduk and Lindsay. So Youngduk Jun is currently working at Nickelodeon as a director. Prior to joining Nickelodeon, he was at DreamWorks for 14 years as head of cinematography on Kung Fu Patrols. His latest work is Vivo at Sony Pictures Animation, which was released by Netflix. Hopefully, and this is actually an older bio. It was actually already came out and is a great movie that you should see, currently available on Netflix. He currently serves the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences and executive committee in the short films and feature animation brands, and mostly Youngduk laughs so much he's always placed in the middle of the theater during the screening. Youngduk, thank you so much for joining us.
No, the Vivo is not out yet.
confuse the
that's
two.
fine. You know, in my mind, it's been already released. But
So yes, so it is not out yet. I was confusing it with Mitchell's. And Lindsay Lim is a recent graduate for the Ringling College of Art and Design, where she studied documentary filmmaking with a minor in creative writing and visual development. She is currently co-directing a doc about the intergenerational differences in the LGBT community and helped to create the diversity infrastructure at Ringling. And this masterclass series was actually her idea, so we're so happy that she's back and working with us again. Lindsay, thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing this to life. Well, before we get started, I also would like to shout out to the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please include the question in your bio, and then we can screen for duplicates, and then we can invite you up to the stage later. So I guess, Young, let's get this ball rolling. To start us off, the first question I have for you guys, what was one of the most challenging shots that you guys have ever worked on, and what was your thought process in creating it?
I can start. I can't tell if Kent was going to start. This is hard.
no, you go ahead. You go for it.
Yeah.
I'd say in more recent memory in Coco, so maybe Matt can speak to this too, but the shot where you introduce the Land of the Dead from the Marigold Bridge was an exceptionally challenging shot that actually maybe I'm still surprised we ever got done. It was an enormous amount of geometry that there's 8.5 million lights in it. How are we going to render it? How are you going to make it look not just like a giant pile of geometry, but like something magical, which is what it's supposed to be in the movie, and but also be able to carve the characters out so you can see what's happening. And there was a point where Disney put it in a trailer, and we weren't even close to done with it, and we asked, could we please not have it in the trailer? And they said, no, it needs to be in the trailer. And it was taking 1,000 hours a frame, somewhat parallelized, but and then it would fail, so we didn't even get a final image. And so, I don't know, with those trailers, you don't have very long to deliver, so it was sort of a mad rush to even get that in the trailer. If you ever compared the trailer to the final film version, they definitely look different. I don't know, Matt, if that shot was challenging in the slightest for you, but...
I mean, it was, but, probably for different reasons. The set, when we were first starting out, was really just still getting fleshed out, so we were framing for something that wasn't entirely there yet, so it evolved, but I think lighting absolutely had the harder end of that shot. I mean, I'm just racking my brain to think of hard shots. There are many, but probably also in Coco was the papel picado, the paper cutout flags that were basically giving us the introduction to the movie, and that was hard because it was just figuring out the space of that. It was well boarded, but actually executing it in real space. And then we had this really tricky problem of wanting things to be doffed out behind all of those to make each of those papel picado read, but we couldn't see it in our software. So we were in countless digital daily reviews and Sweatbox, and realizing that we were out of focus, and it was just endless. And I remember Lee then went back, he went up to the ranch when they went up to start to do the mixing, and we kept on getting fixes on those shots, and we were just guessing. We were literally just counting pixels and then having to fire something off. So that one stands out, mostly technically challenging.
It's a really interesting question. It's rare that I think of things in terms of like the hardest this or the hardest that. I think that all shows have challenging shots, and they're challenging for different reasons. Like, they can be challenging from a technical standpoint. They can be challenging from a creative standpoint. Always the challenging thing from just a camera movement or camera selection standpoint for me are those long oneers. Like, they're the ambitious shot, right? You're trying to combine a bunch of shots into one. You're trying to make it seamless, but you don't want to draw attention to itself. So you're in that sort of position of like trying to create something special, but at the same time, you're trying to be aware of how it affects all the other departments, like lighting or animation, because animation has to break up the shot into components in order for it to be doable. You're aware that the animator has quota, so there's a ton of things. So if I had to think of my last show, Rumble, which is always the last show sort of stands out in your mind, it's about monster wrestling, like 50-foot monsters that are wrestled. And there's a final battle, as you can imagine, between like the two main monsters. And there's a long, continuous take in show where we actually had a client vendor model where like, you know, we were doing. I think we lost Kent. It's super complicated, and you have to sort of communicate that through, and it's some. Oh my!
Oh no, Ken.
We lost Kent. Oh my! Probably we could talk something while Ken is out. Let me just fill in until he comes.
I can go too after you're done.
Oh yeah, what? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, are you done? Okay.
Oh, no, I think if you're ready, then just go ahead. I was just gonna try to fill in all the time. So
Yeah.
go ahead, what?
Yeah, to answer the question, for me, one of the big challenges was on Frozen, and like was said before, every movie has its own challenges in different ways. On Frozen, one of the big challenges was the building of the ice palace itself. So it's not really one shot; it's like a series of shots, but it was super complex in terms of the level of collaboration that we needed to do to make that happen across multiple departments. So it took a long time. We started with visual development to even try to figure out how this thing is going to, come to life. So we iterated a lot in Paint, in 2D Paint, to kind of get the concept done. And then once we got into production, it was one of those things again. So many departments collaborating together, and one depending on the other. For example, layout would place some cameras and move things around without really having the effects in place, and then animation would go with those cameras and animate Elsa's movements. But then layout would have to go back again and polish the cameras to that movement. While FX was developing the effects, and then they had to get the camera and with Elsa's motion. So it was like a very circular process to kind of get to the final result, and that's not even talking about all the technical difficulties with building a whole palace of ice made of ice. So I think that stands out in my mind as a particularly challenging thing.
That sounds like the effects were almost its own character. That the sets of characters that you had to animate after the fact.
Exactly, and they were developing the effects as we were working on the Ice Palace build itself, which is also an FX element. But there were so many different FX elements, combined to make that work. That we did do a lot of, like I said, BizDev, even on the effects, to see what all types of effects were needed and the timings of them and all of that. So it took a long time, and we were working on it during production. So that was especially hard.
That sounds so difficult. And, really kudos to your team for being able to pull through and make something so beautiful.
Thank you.
And Kent, you cut off in the middle of your thought. Do you want to finish what you were saying?
I wonder what happened to Kent.
Kent, I guess we'll come back to Kent. Young Duck, do you have any, stories of hardship from the...
Oh yeah, I did. All the shots are very challenging. But creatively, it's not so difficult. But technically, I had a really tough time working on Kung Fu Panda. On Breach fight, the Furies 5 versus Tyrone 5, the Breach fight was super challenging. It's because the Breach was not like solid. It was a swing, left and right, and also the character, whenever it leans over, the rope kind of moves. And then the weight
speed changes, and he changed the balance, and then it was constantly swinging and left and right. That was really difficult to shoot, like very naturally, organically, because we don't want to lock it. Also, we don't want to lock the camera to the rope when it's swinging for an entire sequence. And the rig of the bridge was super complicated. Probably not many people know about the bridge rig. We had a huge meeting, then we decided to use Viper, Viper, the Viper character. We used actually Viper character rig to build a bridge fight on Kung Fu Panda. It actually took about 16 to 18 months to complete the entire sequence. We had a bridge task force team of like 7 or 8 department head meet every week. First, it was every week, and the second, it became every other week to talk, discuss how we're going to do this thing. The second challenge was the vertical escape, the Tylum escaping sequence. That we couldn't have used entire length of the prison because a precision problem. Everything started shaking. So during the shoot, we had to move the entire prison, the vertical prison, up and down to keep it into the certain limitation from the origin. That was a huge. That was super challenging. But we don't have to do that anymore. But since around 2005 and 2006, we had a problem with the precision. Yeah. The rest is. It's fun, figuring out a problem is always fun. A creative challenge is not actually challenging, it's actually more fun. Yeah. Done speaking.
That sounds so difficult. And it makes me wonder, was there ever anything, for all of you guys, was there ever anything that, you guys tried and tried and tried and it just didn't pan out?
And maybe Matt, do you have any incident?
I'm trying to think. I mean, the precision thing you're talking about, that seems to, we run into that on every film. And I remember back on Wall-E, we really, because, you're up in outer space and we were dealing with just these massive units. And we literally had to create a pivot essentially on the whole world of all these shots and essentially move them back to the origin. And I feel like we're right now on Lightyear, same thing. We're dealing with space, outer space stuff, but we have a much better handle on how to tackle that type of thing. But on Incredibles 2, the same thing happened with the ship. Basically, that thing was just traveling a ridiculous amount of distance, and Brad always wanted it to feel like it was a certain speed. But in order to do that, we basically had to kind of same thing, put it on a pivot and just reoriented every few shots or something. It was, anybody watching the film won't notice it, but it was just a big cumbersome technical hurdle. In terms of something that we couldn't pull off, I can't think of anything that we just said, oh no, we can't do this, and I feel like that's, nobody can basically get away with that. I think if the director wants it, we've got to do our best to figure it out, and sometimes you set up a little unit or just a team, as one maybe Young Duck was mentioning, or Mohit, that you just basically figure out how to do it no matter what.
I think my favorite one of those, or maybe the closest run one I ever saw, I don't know, Matt, if you remember any of this, but it was on the first Incredibles, and Violet had long hair, and long hair was an unsolved problem in computer graphics at that point. And so being on the lighting team, she gets wet, and Mom tucks her hair behind her ears, and so some of our smartest people are working on long hair. And sitting in lighting, we were very, we were end of pipeline. We had to just wait for stuff to come to us. At that point, we overlap more now, but we'd look at the renders coming out of the simulation apartment, thinking, when is this getting to us? We're running out of time. And you'd go peek at their renders, and Violet's hair would look like Marge Simpson's beehive or something, like it would just be this mess of hair sticking straight up and think, well, I guess we're not there yet. So that one made it, but it definitely was, felt kind of down to the wire from where I was in lighting at least.
Yeah, and Merida's hair on Brave, presented its own challenges as well.
Yeah, 3 years it took to make her hair. Crazy.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's not so much a question of what did we try and ended up giving up. It's more about getting a team together to figure it out. Like Matt was saying, we always have like these little teams we put together to figure out challenging problems, and partnering with our technology teams, and we have amazing R&D teams and things like that. So as soon as we know what the challenges are, it's about kind of figuring out how to tackle that. As long as obviously we go through the steps of talking to the directors to see what is really important from a story standpoint and all of that, and kind of weed out the complex stuff that doesn't really help the story progress, so that we are optimizing as we are going along in that sense. But whenever things are important for the story, like I mentioned, the building of the ice palace was like a tremendous challenge, but we knew we had to do it. So it's about putting the right team together and just figuring it out.
So this is Matt. So we have some new people that are joining in. So just to quickly reset the room, this is part of the Animation Industry Club's masterclass talking to cinematographers in animation.
And it seems we have Kent back. Kent, are you there?
Yeah, I'm having some weird. I'm on an Android, so I think this is like an early version of it on Clubhouse. So like it just seems to overheat my phone. So if I go out, that's probably why.
Welcome, Android.
I've had to restart my phone like 3 times. Sorry, my apologies, because I actually want to hear what everyone else has to say.
It was amazing, Ken.
Yeah, I'm sure I missed out. I totally missed out on everyone's really.
Just these mind-blowing revelations that you missed out on.
I know. I'm sure. I mean, I think that it should be pointed out though for your audience that like you have the sort of cinematography and animation is very different from live action in a lot of ways because it's sort of components, right? In live action, your cinematographer not only does your shot selection, your camera placement, they have the whole grip team that sort of moves the camera, but you have your gaffers and electricians who set up all the lights, and it's all done at once, right? But in animation, like you have, and this is what's great about this talk, is you have the representation of the lighting side and the camera side, right? And so that's a big distinction. And it's one of the things that separates animation from live action in terms of its counterpart, right? And so the idea of director of photography, it really is a split task. And I think that's a really interesting part about like Pixar really does a good job, and hats off, and so does now Disney, since they're sort of in the same camp now of sort of highlighting both aspects of cinematography in terms of like you've got like Matt on the phone, on the call or on the panel, so representing camera placement and sort of shot selection, but at the same time you've got the whole lighting side represented. So like it's very good to have both because they work together to create the image, right? And so it's when I first got into animation, it was sort of striking the difference between live action and sort of animation, and that distinction is super important because in order for it to really feel like one cohesive movie, the two departments and the two aspects of it have to work together.
I agree. I mean, one thing I think Danielle and I have really witnessed in the last 10 years or more is how much that space has collapsed between layout and then lighting. I mean, it used to be months before we would see the first lights show up in a shot, and the thing would go to animation, and then the danger in those cases was that they'd be animating something that then would be pretty obscured later on, and so now they're essentially starting lighting while we're doing and then we're getting an early preview of it in our software, and I just feel like it's no longer the big separation between those two departments that it used to be, and thankfully.
Yeah, and I think that's all for the better, right? And this idea of, so this sort of, when computer graphics really started because of technology limitations, everything was pretty siloed and sort of, well, at first everyone was a generalist, and then in order to make a big studio animated picture, you had to have specialists. So it ended up being that everyone sort of had their specialty, and so the big challenge was the communication between all the departments and getting them together and having a singular vision. But with the advent of more real-time technology and faster render engines and computers and multiple processing and deferred rendering and all that stuff, you're starting to be able to converge these things into sort of a more unified sort of workflow. And it's going to be very exciting in the next 10 years to see how that affects both departments, not just the layout side, but also the lighting side, and how much. I think what you're going to do is what's happening, what you've mentioned, Matt, and about Pixar, is that you're going to have lighting people coming into layout and sort of lighting stuff that we're doing with the camera shot selection and informing our shot selection more directly. And ultimately, you want that, right? Because light on dark, dark on light, composition, those are all parts of composition. Actual real-time depth of field, to be able to see how those things affect the image, affects our decisions on where we place that camera, what lens we use, how do we move that camera, how do these shots cut together. I found it was the other benefit was actually on the editorial side, for them to see it affected the cut of like how they cut the movie together, to see how the close-ups cut with the wides and how much time they needed for each of those shots.
Absolutely.
Kent, you're answering all our future questions. Please.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, like, it's an exciting thing to be in an industry that is always changing, but it's also very nerve-wracking, right? Because you're trying to find your footing, and it's difficult when you're always seeing these new things coming up. And I think part and parcel for anyone that's ahead of a department is to decide what parts of that technology you want to utilize and when. Like, is it ready for prime time, so to speak? And if you're going to make a change and embrace some of these new technologies, who does it displace? And we're in Silicon Valley. I'm in Silicon Valley, and there's the word disruption is used quite a bit. I mean, these are disruptive technologies, right? And we are inherently creative people, but we're also technical people. So it's a matter of combining the two things and trying to get the best creative result from those technologies.
That's actually a good point. Kent, currently you're at Nickelodeon, right?
That's right.
What your plan to bring those two teams together? It's been always challenging, and you're starting a new project. Do you have any plan?
Well, right now, every time you start something new, and Nickelodeon hasn't had layout or previs, so I'm more of a specialist in sort of this idea of previs that come from that live action. And they haven't had that at Nickelodeon. So the first thing is, do we have anything to work with? How do we establish protocols? And then I always say, there's the thing you can have now, and there's the thing you can have 5 years from now, and there's the thing you can have 10 years from now. So you always have to sort of think in those terms and like how you use the technology. Because of course, I would want everything now that I had at every other job, but those things don't exist. So I think the first thing you have to do is just establish a basic framework for working. The other thing is you have to get the trust of your director and your show. So there may be agendas or things I want to do with like previs at Nickelodeon, but those things aren't possible yet, or they're not right for the show. And I think every one of the panelists here have had things they want to do. Realize the show, that's not what the priority of the show is. So trying to figure out those things is always difficult and challenging, and sometimes you make missteps along the way. But I'm always of the mindset of I always describe myself as a maximalist when it comes to layout. Like, I'm trying to put as much context into the shot as possible so that the director and the heads of the departments and the studio can make the best decision for the movie. So I think if I use that as my guiding North Star, that's what I'm trying to move toward. You may start off without some of those things, like lighting. Lighting is a tricky one. So you want to make sure you're representing that in the truest way possible and not sending people. If you do something that's distracting, then it's not helping, do the shot or tell the story. So, and a lot of it is just higher levels of collaboration. Like, that's what I strive for mostly, is a high level of collaboration. I'm not an expert in every field, and nor should I be, but at the same time, there's expertise out there that if they had a chance to see their work and express their ideas sooner, they would be able to iterate faster. And so you're trying to create a process that allows those people to iterate and a forum in which to discuss them.
You're in the new studio, so you maybe be able to invent new workflow and pipelines. What about Matt? You've been in a Pixar for a while. How do you feel you can?
I mean, obviously we did a big software change back on Brave. That was the first one. We've been using this proprietary software that had been kind of evolving since Pixar's very beginnings, and then they just decided that it needed a whole, just overhaul. So it was painful. Something like that through its paces is to basically try it out on a film. and it honestly took probably a good 2 or 3 films for it to really get up and running into the level that people wanted. But I think what we see with people are constantly talking about how do we really explore different looks at the studio, and I think just seeing what obviously Spider-Verse did, and then hearing those people speak, they pretty much had to throw out their entire pipeline and start from scratch because if you're basing all of your upcoming films and future films on the tools and things that you have currently in-house, then I think to some degree that's going to restrict how much you can push the looks if you're really wanting to try something far out. So, but a film has to basically allow for that if you're gonna. And I know that it was really difficult from everything I read and heard on Spider-Verse. So I think it's just a constant source of discussion, at the studio. I mean, Danielle, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Oh yeah, I mean it's. Matt, you're talking about one piece of software that's a major one there, but like lighting switched over software on Finding Dory, and like years and years of kind of developing that to the place where we want it, and then the conversations kick up about, well, should we switch to something now? And then you have all your sort of multitude of tools, and so everything is always changing. As you start getting into wanting new looks and stylizing things and doing, some director asks for crazy things, then how that affects the tool set. And so the only constant is that it's all changing, I think.
Hey, Lindsay, this is a very interesting topic. We can talk about this like all day. Maybe we should move on to the next question.
Yes. Ken, you kind of approached a topic that I also heard in Danielle in your TED Talk. You would talk about like the bridge between science and art and creating wonder. And then you also mentioned these little eureka moments that happen when you solve something. And you mentioned this happened with Wall-E with the eye lenses. So, for all the panelists, what are some of your eureka moments, those magical moments when suddenly something comes to place?
I mean, I'm happy to. Can you guys hear me? Wow, am I still on?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so I can talk about one that's actually not necessarily, and this may not be 100% right for this talk, but like, the biggest eureka moment I had was probably on the first Iron Man film, and it had to do with the heads-up display shots of Robert Downey Jr. inside the mask with the graphics in front of his face, and they were done by a vendor called The Orphanage, and they were in San Francisco. They're no longer around, and they did a fantastic job. But it was a real struggle to get there, to get to that look of the graphics in front of Tony's face, and to match the performance with the graphics. And I think that the thing that happened there was allowing the individual visual effects artists to know the story of the shot. That was sort of the big moment where they could design the graphics to basically support in subtext what is happening in the shot. And I think I've heard and read talks from Matt and Danielle about the works they've done on some of the other films. And I think subtext is the big thing that people forget a lot of times, is that what we were doing ultimately isn't just making a cool shot or a beautiful shot or a green shot or a blue shot. We're doing something that supports the storytelling. And if you use that to come back to over and over again, I think it leads to better solutions. And it was the moment where in visual effects, what you don't realize is most of the time the individual visual effects artist has never seen the film or read the script. They just get notes, like make it go faster, make it more blue. And they're not understanding why those things are happening simply because the director doesn't have time to give that note and tell them all the things they have to know. But I spent a good 2 hours telling the story of Iron Man till the individual visual effect understood why the shot that they were working on was important to the movie. And I think that's something that comes back over and over again as a supervisor, is providing context to the artists so they can make good, informed choices.
What about Mohit? You've been quiet. We're talking about a lot of cameras. Mohit, are you available to talk?
Yeah, sure. Eureka moments, not so much as a revelation, but throughout, the past, decade or two, there have been so many innovations that once we get our hands on it, we're like, how did we live without without this before, like even if it's from when we switched over to GI rendering, we were on RenderMan, and then on Big Hero 6 we developed our own renderer, and once we started using that, it's like, wow, how did we live without this? It's those kind of things that kind of stick in my mind. And more recently in the GI, with all of the advances in machine learning and denoising, for example, the results are so fantastic. When you look at the results and what we are doing before that, it's just night and day. It's not much of a eureka moment, but something you use and then you go, how did we live without this? How did we ever do without this? Before. That is pretty incredible. And like Danielle was saying, I mean, things keep changing and things keep getting faster and better. So, but at the same time, I feel like for example, with the RAMs on our machines, we have, I don't know, hundreds of gigs of RAMs on a machine, and yet even today we are able to fill that up while we are working. Like, we are getting, even though things are getting faster and better, we manage to find a way to kind of max that out somehow.
Yeah, I think computer animation is the best example of Moore's law, right? You always max out everything you've got, right? So like, you think, oh, now I've got enough, and everything will work smoothly, and then nope, you just add more stuff into your shot. You just add more complexity, more polys, more of this, just more.
Yeah. I mean, I remember working on Dinosaur. My machine had 256 megs of RAM, and that was supposed to be a big machine.
Right.
And now we have that in gigs. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, we notice that every show makes advances, and usually by the last third of the show, everything's really running smoothly. It's those initial months of a film where things are heavy and slow, and we're just kind of slogging through it. But same thing. We basically have these super-powered machines, but then the artistic appetite with each film keeps going up. So it's basically offsetting the gains that you're really making. And which we all want to kind of keep on pushing it, but it's just I just feel like we're never catching up almost to it.
Yeah, the ambition is always just a little bit higher than the capacity.
Exactly.
Just a little bit. It feels like it's within reach, but it's just not quite there.
Another, I would say, I just thought of one eureka moment. So this was recently. Our process in animation is, the animation department itself, the directors go through sequences to the animation department. So they go through all the shots and kind of explain, what the characters are feeling and what's going on, and in terms of animating and emoting, what they're expecting from each shot, from all the characters and such. They go into pretty deep detail on all of those aspects that are related to animation. We never did anything like that in lighting, and again, this is something that I don't know why we didn't do it, but on the recent project that I was on, I said, hey, let's have the directors come into lighting and do sort of a lighting issuing of the entire sequence, and so that they can go through the emotional arcs and all of that, similar stuff to animation, but also talk about what they want to highlight, where they want the viewer's eye, all the things that we do in lighting. What do they expect? What do the directors expect from those aspects? And we did that with the department, and it was fantastic. And from then on, we're like, why didn't we ever do this before? I mean, we had different forms of it, but not sort of a formal, issuing to that deep level, which was kind of interesting. So from that experience, I'm like, okay, at least going forward, I want to see if we can do this on every project, at least every project that I'm on. I know director time is really valuable, but that was one of those things that I was like, okay, I'm going to try to do this from now on. It's just a simple process thing, but it had such a huge impact on the lighting department.
I'm wondering, what are some other ways that you support stories that you've been tasked with through your cinematography?
I mean, you have all these tools at your disposal from a shot selection standpoint. You've got your focal length, what lens you're using, basically what lens are you using to shoot your close-ups. You've got the composition within the frame, like where do you place the character inside that frame, and how do you draw focus to that character? Do you shoot from an up angle, a down angle? Whose perspective are you in? We're constantly talking about point of view. Whose point of view are we trying to feel in this sequence at this part of the movie? Whose journey are we on with right now? Who are we with? Who has power? Like power is a big sort of dynamic, right? Like who is the one that holds the power in the sequence? How does the character change from the beginning to the end of the sequence? And how are we going to use the camera to show that? Like if someone's diminished, do we have them become smaller and framed? I mean, these are very simple, the simplified version of these things, right? And do we isolate them in the frame? Do we take a group of characters and take one and stage them further away? Do we use a wider lens at that point so that the distance is emphasized? When there's conflict coming up, do we use a longer lens to bring the characters closer together to sort of compress the space? All these things are tools at your disposal. Do we use a heavy depth of field so we really isolate this character, or you feel intimate with this character? We're talking about this a lot. One of the big lessons for me that was different from live action was how much in the close-ups it matters to be on axis. Like that was a big change for me in 2008 when I switched into animation. Was we go to the first review and it's really rough for previs or layout, and the director's like, oh, your eye line needs to be on my right cheek. And I was like, well, it's still left or right, so what does it really matter? That was my naivete in looking at it all. It's all about that connection to the character. So there are all these little things that you can do from a cinematography and shot placement perspective. That's even before you get to the lighting side of it, which I'm sure Danielle Mohi could talk about in terms of what the things that they do to sort of emphasize the emotional storytelling that's happening at the moment.
I mean, like you're saying, Kent, there's a huge bag of tricks that we're using all the time, or sort of principles of composition and stuff. But one of the things I think is sort of interesting, I think when I first started trying to light, if someone could just give me the rules, like what does red light mean? What does green light convey? What does underlighting? And sort of as I've gone through my career, really understanding that that there are not these sort of hard and fast rules. And so I've used sort of a character underlit can make them feel scary, like someone standing there telling a ghost story with a flashlight on their face. But I've used the same kind of underlight to convey much more of a kind of intimacy among characters as if you're sitting at a table with candlelight or something. And I've used green light to make something feel more sort of eerie, like something's coming. And then on Coco, we put some green light in a kitchen in this beautiful dust scene because it made it feel more like some of the places we had been in Mexico. So it was really the green light was conveying a sense of place. And so there's sort of all these things to do that you can think about to tell the emotion, but it really does come down to sort of each movie and each shot and each scene and the time of day and what the characters are doing and how to convey exactly what's happening in that moment. And it can be similar things conveying completely different depending on the shot or the movie.
I love that point, actually. That's really fantastic. And I think Danielle really touches on something that's, when people are talking about cinematography or like how do you tell the story, it's really germane to your story, right? So you're making rules for your own movie. So the rules that apply for one movie don't necessarily apply for this one. And I think that the master aspect of masterclass is the ability to understand the cinema that you're telling and to make the appropriate choices for this particular movie and this particular thing. So if you shoot it this way, that's what it means. But it's not necessarily the case. And I think that's a great lesson. I really like hearing that. That reinforces to me, because it's often easy to sort of fall into a trope. And that's why they're tropes, right? Because they're like, oh, this is the way things are done. But I love hearing those specific stories, Danielle, that you told about, sort of of thinking it would mean something, but it actually means something else because of the reference, because of what you felt when you were in the place. I think these are fantastic lessons for anybody. I've done.
It's part of the fun of the job too, right? Like
right.
Everything is always changing, and it isn't a do ABC. It is you have to take each thing for what it is, and I don't know, for me, that's part of the great joy in doing this.
And I think the other thing that people should sort of think about or understand is that it's a giant collaboration. Like cinema and movies is like a unique art form in that it is super collaborative, right? You have usually a director who's the visionary for the film, but on top of that, you have all these department heads who are trying to work together and collaborate to make the movie, and each contribution has to work with the other contribution. We're not siloed in our own little places making our own decisions. Like each one affects other people. So we're trying to guess and work and collaborate and make choices that will help the next department tell their part of the story.
Yeah, and I like what Danielle and Kent are saying, especially the part where Danielle was mentioning. We have a toolbox of stuff that we can use, but then it comes down to, what is the story we are telling? What does the director want? How does the director want the audience to feel in this particular section of the movie? So, and I collaborate with directors, production designers, a whole bunch of people to kind of figure that out, what is actually needed, and then figure out how to achieve that. And sometimes it's like really you might want to do something unexpected. For example, on Frozen, the whole palette of the movie, we call it like a cool jeweled palette. So very blues, a lot of blues and even the warmer colors that warms and cools are all sort of in that blue range. Had some level of blue in it. And then with the Ice Palace, there was a sequence where Hans comes in to capture Elsa, and we were kind of talking through what should we do with this sequence, what color, because we had almost exhausted all shades of blue at that point in the movie. And one of our production designers said, why not yellow? And I was surprised because that production designer really does not like those warm colors, because and that was the whole point of the movie, was it was all like cool jeweled colors. And but thinking about it, it was so appropriate because that sequence is unexpected, that Hans goes there and captures her, and making that into this putting this golden light on it everywhere was unexpected, and that really worked in the context of the story and what was being told. Even though you don't think of golden light as something bad happening, but in that particular case, it really worked.
Those are some wonderful insights. We are running up until we're just about to hit the 1 o'clock mark, and we have some audience questions. So I just wanted to ask before we move into that, if for all of our panelists, if you have to leave exactly at 1, feel free to leave quietly, and I really appreciate you coming. But if you are able to stay, would any of you be able to stay for a few more minutes afterward to answer some more questions?
Sure.
Yeah, I can stay for a little bit more.
I have a meeting, so I have to go.
I've got a meeting as fortunate.
That's too bad, because I want to hear more what everyone else has to say.
I know. Yeah, could have been 2 hours almost.
Got it for round 2. This is so exciting.
I mean, it's exciting for me to hear other industry professionals. I'm always excited to hear how other places do things, and especially like Disney and Pixar. Come on, those giants. I just want to hear how they do stuff and like what the stories are.
Well, I'd like to welcome our first audience question, Raven. Raven, go ahead.
Hi everyone. So I've always been fascinated by cinematography. It's kind of one of the reasons I became a story artist. And I was wondering, how if you at all collaborate with story artists on your shows, and what does that look like?
That is a very interesting question, because in my experience, and I can't speak for everybody else, like you don't get as much access to story. Like they're usually a separated department in a lot of ways. Editorial, and a lot lot of times people don't ever, in production-wise, don't ever meet the story artists. And there are occasions where we get a chance to do it, where maybe we'll scout a location. I've had opportunities where like somebody's going to draw a sequence in a location they've never seen, and so you do a bunch of stills, you work over the shoulder with them, and that's really exciting when they come into your office and you're like, okay, well, what do you think you're going to shoot? And I'm like, over here. I'm like, how about this? And you're trying different lenses, and you're sort of thumbnailing almost backgrounds with like rudimentary character positions, so that the story artist can sort of draw those things. But I think that is a place that's not mined well, to be honest. I think it's a place where there could be way more collaboration that could be happening between story and layout, for sure. Like, that's a place where that could meet, and they should know the rules that, or the sort of the cinematography, strategy that we're going to do in layout, as well as what they're going to want to do in lighting. Sometimes it's too early for the lighting, really, to be honest. Like, that's not always established at that point, but at least the camera strategy should be somewhat established and figured out, or at least some ideas about it, so they can experiment too. But they're rare. It's not as much as you think.
Yeah, I mean, although I have seen at Pixar that happening more and more, and I think people are recognizing the value. I mean, sometimes, well, number one, our schedules have gotten more accelerated. And I think out of necessity, I think people are finding that story artists, especially if something's really hard to figure out and to represent in boards, I think more and more, as Kent was saying, there's a partnership between layout or previs and then story to kind of brainstorm stuff. And then, on Soul just this past year, or a year ago, we, again, because the schedule was so condensed, we were in editorial a lot with the story leads and story artists, and it was kind of a big brainstorming session on some of the sequences, again, where we tag team and figured out, well, how could we figure out some of the stuff that maybe the boards, just wasn't fleshed out in it. But yes, I agree that more and more of that collaboration would be so valuable.
I mean, you see it like a lot of times on a big action sequence, right? Where like the time it takes to draw something is
exactly.
It would just be So you get in this situation where sometimes you're talking about it, they thumbnail a few key shots, and then you sort of fill in the rest, right? And then you get this nice sort of flow where you get the advantage of the fast drawing, but then you have the advantage of in sort of action movement and being able to spline something very quickly.
Yep.
Yeah, and Disney also, like Matt was saying, we've been moving more and more towards more and more collaboration, especially between layout and story, so that when layout gets storyboards from story, they are grounded in some sort of reality to what our sets actually are. So in that space, we have a VR stage where we can bring in our master sets and have story artists like walk around so they know and understand the space and things like that. They've also developed tools that are very, very easy to use for story artists, where they can bring in environments and kind of do very simple cameras and kind of shoot images out so that they can use those environments that they shot out as backgrounds for their storyboards. Things like that, that's happening, and kind of that collaboration is increasing a little bit. And not yet with lighting, but more with layout.
Well, thank you. Thank you for answering that.
Sure.
Alrighty.
And I just brought, so the next question comes from C. Morgan. I don't have a first name for you, C. I'm sorry.
It's Christopher, sorry.
No problem. Hi, Christopher. How are you?
Yeah, my question it kind of relates to what you were talking about earlier with like the Frozen, and in general for everybody, like kind of what like when in the process are you choosing that color palette, and how I guess if it's a very very early on, try to stick with that, or can it
represents the lighting for the movie. Now, all of that is bought off by the directors, but there have been instances where we've gone into lighting and started lighting shots, and then when the directors see it, they have changed their thoughts, and so we had to kind of change our approach to lighting an entire sequence. For example, on Frozen 2, Kristoff's song in the forest when he thinks Anna has left him, we thought of it as like he goes into this fantasy world, into this like 80s music, 80s ballad with reindeer kind of singing and stuff. So we wanted to make sure that it felt like it was fantasy and not like reindeer could suddenly sing and dance. So we came up with this palette of like this really golden palette with a little bit of purple, and we started executing the shots. And as we went through the sequence and we were showing directors, they felt like it didn't feel like it was fantasy enough, like we're enough into fantasy. They still felt like audience might think that this is still reality. So we kind of took a step back and completely changed it, where there was a lot more purple in it because that wasn't quite, it's not natural. So that was one of the sequences where we went back and completely reworked it in terms of color and lighting. So it does happen. Doesn't happen too often, thankfully, but yeah, it does happen.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's a very ongoing process then.
Yeah. And also in my experience, it's different at every studio, but like the production designer is the one driving that initial look. Like they're the ones determining. So that was a big lesson for me when I first got into animation way back in the day. It was like, the production designer is part of that responsibility. The production designer is to design the color keys and how it works through that. It's just those color keys get painted by the art department.
Yeah, it is different in different studios, I believe. I wish Daniel and Matt were here to kind of talk through how it works at Pixar. Yeah. But I mean, Sharon does her own keys, she paints her own keys and things like that. So, whereas at Disney, I do partner with the production designer, and we have a person painting those keys. Sometimes it's a production designer. Sometimes they don't do the keys, but they find somebody who can. We find somebody who can do them, but they usually come from the Viz Dev department.
Yeah. So that's what's interesting is that's how bifurcated the process. Right. You have someone who's super talented like Mohit, who's going to get and collaborate with the visual development department to make the lighting. Right. It's like a number of people's hands in that. That's something you should keep in mind as well.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for answering that. And if you don't mind, a quick little follow-up when it comes to that. The objects that are in the scene have their own color, and like, do you try to compensate the lighting for some of that stuff too? Like, like if a tree is gonna be brown, like textured that way, do you I don't know, do you have to kind of play around with some of those textures, say, to get that look?
Absolutely. I mean, we work very closely. The lighting department works very closely with the look dev department. We call it the look dev department, and some studios call them shade. We work very closely with them. So early on, as we are building the sets, we do have a lighter or two kind of throwing some lights onto at least all of the major sets where a lot of action takes place, and making sure all the textures are balanced, all the colors are balanced, and all of that, and working back and forth with look dev to make sure we are getting what we need out of the materials that they are producing. So yeah, there is a process in place to make sure, and time allocated to make sure we have that time to balance all those materials.
Appreciate. Thank you for indulging my questions.
Absolutely.
No, these are great questions.
Yeah.
And next we have Ivan.
really interesting to be hearing and very insightful. My question would be, what are your sources of inspiration outside of animation? Some live action DPs, photographers, something else? You can say your family, even if they are. Thank you so much.
So you're asking what our interests are outside of what we do for a living, right? Is that what my understanding? Like,
Is it interest or inspiration?
Or inspiration, more inspiration. Like what in your work you have learned outside of other DPs that they work directly on animation? Maybe some other DP of live action, maybe photographer, maybe it's
yeah. I think, I can speak for some of that is like I love movies and, like I'm a big fan of just films and live action films. We've had the benefit of Guillermo Navarro consulting on our movies. He's a master. Roger Deakins consulting on our films. I think Emmanuel Lubezki is a master Chivo, and to see how they shoot. I mean, all the great directors. I mean, Spielberg's Oneers. Those are all like I think that you can draw a lot of inspiration directly from other movies, and that's for sure part of it. I love photography, and I draw a lot of inspiration from good photography. And I'll give you one that's sort of probably not usually on the list is I love sports, and I'm constantly I'm trying to run my own crews like a sports team. Like I feel like that's the way it should feel. Like it should feel like a Bulls from the '90s, and I see myself as sort of the Phil Jackson of that group, and I'm trying to get the best performance out of everybody. And so, as a coach, and looking at trying to maximize the performance that the team is greater than the individual. I love that stuff. Like that's really something that I draw a lot of inspiration from.
That's awesome. That sports analogy is great. Like Kim said, I mean, it's all of the above, like what you were saying, Ivan. Live action DPs. I also love looking at animation DPs, what they're doing, whether it's Pixar or whichever studio. I love watching those movies and drawing inspiration from them. Live action, Kent mentioned some great DPs there. Photography, absolutely, and also just painters, just paintings. I have a lot of books with different painters and things like that, and photographers, and so you can basically get inspiration from anywhere. You could be walking down the street and see a sunset that is just gorgeous, and you're like, wow, okay, that is something that might stick in your mind, and maybe you use something like that as inspiration in one of the shots in the movie, So you never know. These are traditional sources like photography and books on paintings and all that, but you never know where you get your next big inspiration moment from. It could be, like I said, you could be just somewhere and see something that inspires you to bring that back into a movie that you're working on.
I think that the main thing I always think, and this is Mohit, just a reminder of this, is you have to look for inspiration. Like I actively am inspired by my coworkers. Like sometimes I'm amazed at what they produce, and I'm constantly like, wow. It's also very depressing, to be honest. Like I just like go, oh my god, that sucks. I can't do anything like that. That guy's amazing, or that woman's amazing. I can't do anything like that. I'm a terrible person. So you can end up in this sort of self-hatred of sorts out of it all, but it's still for me all inspirational. And I find that when I see people on my own team doing things that exceed their own expectations, that's always a great moment. It's always sort of fantastic. Or I love mentoring people, and when I see a young person or someone who's less experienced, sort of find that next the footing, it's always a great moment because it reminds you what it feels like to be that person. Like I'm old, I'm 50, right? So I'm decrepit. So I'm constantly looking for inspiration, and a lot of times I see inspiration from young people who look at things with a fresh eye. So like I think that's part of what reminds you of the industry you're in and why you're here is you see it through other people's eyes, and that's always a super exciting thing to watch.
You know what? Let me add. Just quick. My emergency inspiration usually it comes like, oh my god, I need to get inspired. I can't do anything. I usually go and listen to soundtracks, movie soundtracks. It really boosts my everything, my energies and emotional levels and everything.
great one.
Yeah, that's just my emergency kind of situation that I get inspired.
That's a good one, young duck. Yeah, it's totally true. Like what you're listening to affects, how what you're doing. So I think Mohit said it right. There's inspiration all around, and that the easy ones are like movies, other movies, or people do what you do. But then it's amazing when you can find inspiration in other things like music or eat food or just, it's all around you. So I would encourage you.
Thank you so much for your great responses.
Sure.
Well, I have one question from Discord. Can I share that? Do we still have time? I don't want to. I know we've already gone 10 minutes beyond what you guys had generously agreed to give us with your time.
Go for it. I say late.
So I know that we have a lot of students listening. So I think this is kind of a more academic question. Do you have any books or sources that come to mind that have impacted your work in terms of cinematography?
My favorite book on filmmaking and cinematography isn't a book on cinematography, it's a book on editing called In the Blink of an Eye.
Walter Murch.
The legendary Walter Murch. If you want to have your mind blown about like shot selection and cutting, and because you have to exist, your cinematography doesn't exist in a vacuum. Read that book. That is a fantastic, highly recommend that one.
Yeah, I love that choice. Again, this is not particular to cinematography, but it does contain aspects of it. It's called The Visual Story by Bruce Block. I think that has a lot of good information in it, just general story and composition.
I'm sorry, who was the author of that? The Visual Story by who?
Bruce Block.
Thank you.
Bruce Major Studio. So like if you hear like, oh, the screen direction, what is your screen direction for the movie here? Like, what is the affinity and contrast? That's a Bruce Block concept. Those are things that like will resonate in that book.
Yeah,
that's a great choice, Mohit. Great choice.
Thanks. It's difficult to pinpoint one book. It's like saying, hey, who's your favorite DP or which is your favorite movie in terms of cinematography? That is like really hard to pinpoint just one thing. I have, like, Ken, probably you too, I have cupboards full of books on different subjects, like color, for example. So it's hard to pinpoint one, but yeah, those two are pretty good choices.
I think they're good to start with, and then build out your library. Like that's another thing is like build out your art book library. Constantly watch. It could be a consumer of storytelling. Like I can't tell you. Like I'm still a student. That's what I feel like. I feel like I'm still a student right now. I'm still learning, and that's one of my big sort of goals on every movie is to learn something. And so I think if you constantly do that, there's nothing you can do wrong with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Visual Story by Bruce Block, I use that as my textbook to teach at Keller.
Yeah, there you go.
It's an amazing book.
So from a professional and a professor.
Yeah.
I recommend like 1,000 times.
Awesome.
Hey Matt, from our brother Hammy, mutual friends.
Oh my God, is Hamilton Lewis?
Watch out, guys. Hey, sorry, I'm super late. I apologize. No, I was in a meeting, but I wanted to stop in and say hi, and couldn't be more as I worked for a long time with Young Duck and Kent at DreamWorks, and now I'm off in my own marvelous world. But if I learned anything from these guys, it would absolutely have to be about the passion and about kind of protecting your crew. And I learned a lot from these guys about supervising and what it takes to keep the ball rolling when things are hard. You get really hard notes, or there's a lot of redo on a sequence, and what it takes to not only like move the picture forward creatively, but in a morale way and help art grow. And I think that's the first thing whenever a new artist comes on my show is what I ask them, like, not only where you've been, but like what do you want to be and where do you want to go, and what can I help you learn along the way to do that. And is it going to be animation? Is it going to be leadership? Is it going to be effects? Or whatever part of previs layout it's going to be. So anyway, very complimentary to these guys.
You should be heckling me, man, Hamilton.
Oh, come now. No. Couldn't be happier. It's good. No, old man Seki, whatever. He'll beat us up the mountain. He's got so much energy. He'll beat us all
guys up here, Hamilton, and also I'd like to thank Pitt for being part of our panel and for co-moderating with me. I really appreciate this. This has been a really fun.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the panel as well. Thank you so much, and thank you, Young Duck and Lindsay, for moderating. I have a couple of quick plugs, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So for anybody who's listening, who has enjoyed this talk, we do them every week. So please follow the Animation Industry Club on Clubhouse. You can do that by clicking the little green house at the top of the screen that says Animation Industry, and just click to follow us. So next week, for instance, we are having a very, very interesting conversation about creativity and mental health with Steven Silver, Professor James Kaufman from the University of Connecticut, Professor and producer Laverne McKinnon. So that's going to be next Wednesday at noon. So just please follow us, and so we can keep having these great conversations.
You're gonna hear creative people crazy. No, I'm kidding.
Nice, Marie. Nice.
There's challenges that study the intersection of creativity and
Super interesting.
Well, thank you for having us, and this was like super interesting for me as well, because when we are busy, we tend to get sort of silo by ourselves in our own world, and it's really fun to kind of hear what is going on and at different studios and how things are being approached and what's happening. So for me, it's been a fun one. So if you guys ever think of doing a part 2 or something, let me know.
I feel like we probably could do a part 2 of cinematography. I felt like we kind of ran out of time. We lost 2 of our panelists along the way because I think there was so much going on.
I mean, it's interesting because what Hamilton came in and said is like, we didn't even talk about the job. Like, there was actually the whole other component of it. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what the job is, right? Like, it's like, oh, you walk into a room and then you say, this is where the camera's going to go, or, that work.
Yeah.
And how important it is to work with other people, and how you work with your team and how you give notes. I mean, all those kinds of things.
I already signed up to moderate some sessions for us.
Yeah, I feel like a sequel to this conversation just kind of built itself.
Well, every project is different. Every client, every team is different, and how you negotiate that, how you get down the river like that. Yeah.
It's a whole other side of it. That's like.
Yeah, and I don't know if the audience is more students or
professional,
so we could kind of think of that, do the composition, and kind of come up with something.
Yeah, I think that there's a very natural part 2, and since you guys, maybe you can help us work on this one as well. So I do have one other thing that I to include. So this club is brought to you by the Animation Industry Club on Clubhouse. So the founders, we all work on this because we love it, but we also have full-time jobs. So we are eager to hire an intern, and we are particularly eager to pay that intern for any work that they can do for us. So if anybody has been enjoying this conversation or previous conversations, if you actually click on Maureen's profile and press click money, anything that you'd be willing to donate would go entirely to the hiring of an intern to work on this for us. And then one last thing. So Maureen is the co-founder of this club, and she's the CEO of Baobab Studios. And next weekend, on June 5th and 6th, Baobab Studios and Gallery Nucleus are doing an exclusive gallery showing of Baobab Studios artwork and selling signed copies of their 2 art books, Art of Baobab and Art of Baba Yaga. So go to Gallery Nucleus website or follow Baobab Studios to learn more. I wanted to include that while I had everybody's attention.
Thank you.
But I believe in paying interns. If anybody has been enjoying these conversations and can, I think unpaid internships are for the birds. We need to pay these people.
Good point.
Hey, Lindsay did an amazing job. You did it. You're right.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
Lindsay is amazing. She's absolutely amazing.
And it was Lindsay's idea, right? Bring people together for today. Good job.
It was super fun. Super fun. Sorry about my phone problems.
Oh no, I totally understand phone problems. And honestly, it's thanks to you guys for helping me get this off the ground and for taking my suggestions. I really appreciate that.
It's all good.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope to see all of these avatars again next week and in future Animation Industry Clubhouse conversations. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Ken. Bye, Mike.
Bye.
Bye, Hammy.
Bye, Dots.
Hi everyone, thank you all so much for tuning into our Clubhouse talk today. We hope you'll tune in next week at 12 p.m. PST or 3 p.m. EST for our creativity and mental health talk with Steven Silver and Dr. James C. Kaufman. But again, thank you all for coming today. We hope you enjoyed and learned a lot, and thanks for your awesome questions. So yeah, have a great rest of your day or night or afternoon, wherever it may be, wherever you are. So thanks again, and we'll see you next week.